the moon goes down for about 20 miles as a solid structure. And then on the inside, there's a distance of about 1,000 miles radially out from the center is hollow inside the moon.
If there was a city, why is it only on the dark side?
Well, because that side faces away from us all the time.
So because whoever built it doesn't want us to see it?
Of course. Of course. That's the convenient place to put it. There's also another reason that's technical, which is that if you put, we've been studying this in terms of potential lunar colonization, that if you put listening telescopes, like the Arecibo dish, stuff that's meant to convey signals across space. If you put it on the side of the moon that faces the Earth, there's too much interference with radio signals coming from the Earth. So if you want to have basically interspace communication from the moon to elsewhere, it's better to put something on the side that always faces away from us so that you're not bombarded with radio signals that are being transmitted from the Earth.
Right.
That's a technical reason why you would do it. But mainly, I think it's, for concealment purposes. Okay, but the story of what's going on the moon is a lot more. It's a lot more startling than finding a city on the dark side of it, right? Because you could be dealing with a natural satellite that has been colonized at who knows what time by whatever spacefaring civilization. No, it looks like there's a much more disturbing scenario here, and our government became aware of this during Apollo 12 and 13. During Apollo 12, I think it was the lander that impacted the moon in a way that set off a seismometer that had been pre-positioned there. There was a seismograph that was pre-positioned on the moon. And when the Apollo 12 lander hit the surface of the moon, the signal that came from this seismograph was consistent with the ringing or vibration of a hollow object.
Right.
So the way that the shock wave passed through the moon suggested that there was very little inside the moon.
Right.
Okay? It rang like a bell, as they described it.
For a while, right?
In the first case, it was for almost an hour. So then they got curious about this. And in Apollo 13, they deliberately crashed the third stage of Apollo 13 into the surface of the moon to carry out a test to see whether this was a repeatable phenomenon, right? And this time, the seismograph not only confirmed the resonance passing through a hollow object, but the moon rang like a bell for 3 hours. So, and they were able to tell like how much more or less of the moon, is apparently hollow.
Right.
And it's really shocking. It's like the moon goes down for about 20 miles as a solid structure. And then on the inside, there's a distance of about 1,000 miles radially, 1,000 miles from the interior of the shell to the core, radially in every direction. In other words, the distance between Los Angeles and Seattle, or New York and St. Louis, or Paris and Prague, out from the center is hollow inside the moon.
There was a recent NASA article that came out, I think it was on the NASA website, where they said they discovered caves, like underground caverns in the moon, which would suggest that it was like maybe like a honeycomb structure on the inside or something like that.
I suspect that it's not natural caverns, but that what they're seeing are the hollows between all kinds of complex machinery that are inside that structure. One of the other things that they noted with these impact tests was that the moon it seemed to compensate and correct for the impact in a way that suggested there were oscillators inside the structure.
Right.
So I think probably there's machinery inside this thing. Now, another data point that corroborates that, going back to the remote viewers, is that Joe McMoneagle was tasked with remote viewing Mars in 1984. And this was a CIA operation run at the Monroe Institute. So it was CIA. He was working on contract for the CIA, And this was done at the Monroe Institute.
He was the first remote viewer, right?
I think he might have been. Well, no, I think Ingo Swann was the first remote viewer. Okay. But I think he had the designation 001 or something like that.
Yeah, one. Maybe it was 2. I don't know.
Yeah. But in any case, in 1984, Monroe Institute, and this has since been released. This is one of these classified documents that has since been declassified. It's called like Mars 1 million BC. You can look it up. Joe McMoneagle.
Mars 1 million BC.
Yeah, Joe McMoneagle. And so, look, Joe McMoneagle is tasked to look at. He doesn't know, of course. He's working blind to the target. That's how remote viewing is, right? But what's inside these envelopes are the photographs that the Viking probe took on Mars in 1976, where we got back these images of the pyramids and the fort and the face, infamously, right? So there are all these apparent man-made megalithic structures in the Cydonia region of Mars, which were first photographed by the Viking mission in 1976. And that's what was inside these envelopes when McMoneagle was doing this remote viewing session. And he described being in the midst of the ruins of a megalithic city with gigantic pyramids. He said they seemed like they were maybe 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid in Giza.
Wow.
And he described...
part of the Stargate project.
Yeah, he described a maze of structures under these pyramids, like subterranean tunnels and hallways. Mm-hmm. At one point, he walks through one of these hallways, and it leads to an opening, and he finds himself on the outside of the pyramid looking up at it, looking up across the face of the pyramid. And he describes also these highways that are trenches. They're these perfectly geometric trenches cut across miles and miles of Mars' surface. And he said his impression was that they were used for a craft. Like, you know, there are bad storms on Mars, right? So if you had hover cars or whatever, you would want them to be transiting through something that had high walls on either side. That was a, sunken channel, basically.
To avoid a sandstorm.
To avoid a sandstorm passing over the top of your head.
Yeah, like some Star Wars
So
shit.
this is basically, he describes this, okay, during his remote viewing session.
Yeah.
But he says, look, the civilization is long dead. I'm seeing, the ruins of a civilization that once was eons before this. And he was tasked at 1 million BC. So they said to him, okay, so go back to when these people were still alive and thriving. And he goes way, way back. Now, we can infer from another data point that I'll come to, how far back he went.
Okay.
But he doesn't say in the session. But he goes back to when these people were around. And then he describes Nordic-looking, super tall people in skin-tight jumpsuits. People who look like Scandinavians, except he said they had more like like between an Olympic swimmer and a football player's physique with very broad shoulders, not an ounce of body fat. He said he could see all their musculature through their skin-tight suits. And what McMoneagle relates is that these people were facing the end of their civilization. And some of them had this, what he describes as very philosophical sense of resignation, where they were like, well, we had our time. It's not fair for us to ask for more time. We've had more time than we should have had, some of them. And some of them are still trying to survive and endure. And the ones who are trying to survive, he says, they've looked for a way out. And no matter what they do, they can't seem to find a way out. So just pin that somewhere, right? Then he says they designed and got into a spacecraft that was cylindrical, and which is very much the description of a lot of these cylinder-shaped, cigar-shaped UFOs, metallic, cigar-shaped craft. And they went to another planet, which they were scouting out to see whether it was a viable world for them to relocate to. And this other planet was nothing like Mars. It was very green, overgrown with vegetation, in fact. But there were constant storms on it, electrical storms, typhoons. There was a lot of volcanic activity on this planet. And they basically concluded that they couldn't settle there without altering the planet, without terraforming it in some way to make it more habitable. So
this is a long conversation to have during a remote viewing session.
Yeah, so they got all this out of him, right? I think those are all the important points. And
very detailed.
Yes.